The 18th of April, 1942, Tokyo, Japan. The air raid sirens should have been wailing. Japanese citizens should have been running for shelter. But the skies over the imperial capital were quiet, serene, even. Why would they be otherwise? Tokyo was untouchable. The American fleet was thousands of miles away, licking its wounds from Pearl Harbor. The nearest U.S. base was so far that no bomber in existence could make the journey and return. Or so they thought. At 12:15 p.m., the impossible happened. A lone B-25 Mitchell bomber roared over the rooftops at treetop level, its twin engines screaming. Then another, and another. 16 American bombers in total, striking the heart of the Japanese Empire with such audacity that even as the bombs fell, many on the ground couldn't process what they were seeing. This wasn't just a military operation. This was a psychological earthquake. But to understand how American pilots achieved the impossible, we need to go back 4 months to the darkest moment in U.S. military history. The 7th of December, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The surprise attack that killed over 2,400 Americans and crippled the Pacific Fleet didn't just damage ships, it shattered the nation's sense of invincibility. In the weeks that followed, Japan seemed unstoppable. Hong Kong fell, Manila fell. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, fell. America was reeling, desperate for hope, for revenge, for something to prove they could hit back. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was clear with his military commanders. We need to strike Japan. We need to do it soon. I don't care how. Figure it out. The problem? It was literally impossible. Japan's home islands were 2,000 miles from the nearest American base. U.S. bombers didn't have that range. Aircraft carriers could get closer, but their planes were too small to carry meaningful bomb loads to Tokyo. Even if they could, Japanese naval patrols extended 700 miles from the coast. Any carrier spotted that far out would be sunk before its planes ever launched. The Navy brass ran the numbers again and again. Every scenario ended in failure or suicide. Then, a Navy captain named Francis Lowe was watching aircraft training at a naval air station when he had a wild, ridiculous idea. An idea so crazy, it just might work. What if they launched Army bombers from a Navy carrier? January 1942, the Pentagon. When Captain Lowe brought his idea to Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, he expected to be laughed out of the room. Army bombers were massive compared to carrier planes. Everyone knew they were far too heavy, too long, too everything to take off from a carrier deck. But King didn't laugh. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. Get me the best aviation mind in the Navy. Get me Jimmy Doolittle. Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle was already a legend. He'd won air races, set speed records, been the first pilot to fly blind using only instruments. He was 45 years old, ancient by pilot standards, but still flew like a man possessed. More importantly, he was an MIT-trained engineer who could calculate fuel consumption, takeoff distances, and bomb loads in his head. When Doolittle heard the plan, he didn't flinch. "It's possible," he said quietly. Barely possible, but possible. The requirements were insane. They'd need bombers that could take off in less than 500 feet, less than half the normal distance. They'd need to strip the planes of every unnecessary ounce of weight. They'd need crews willing to fly a one-way mission, because there was no way they were landing these heavy bombers back on a carrier deck. And they'd need to do it all in absolute secrecy. If Japan caught wind of the plan, it would end before it began. Doolittle handpicked 80 men for the mission volunteers who didn't know what they were volunteering for. They were told only that it was extremely hazardous and that they might not come back. Not one man refused. March 1942, Eglin Field, Florida. The training was brutal and bizarre. The pilots practiced taking off from a runway with markers showing a carrier deck's length. They had to get 31,000 pounds of bomber airborne in under 500 feet, with full fuel tanks and 2,000 pounds of bombs. One miscalculation meant plunging into the ocean. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, one of the pilots, later wrote, "We'd roar down that white line, every instrument screaming, and you'd think you're going to die. Then, right at the edge where the runway markers ended, you'd pull back and pray. Sometimes you'd clear, sometimes you wouldn't clear by much. They practiced low-level flying so low that they skimmed over trees and farmhouses, giving Florida residents the shock of their lives. They needed to fly at treetop level to avoid radar, but one mistake meant death. They trained in navigation over water with no landmarks. They trained in dropping bombs from 1,500 feet far lower than normal bombing altitude. They trained until every man could fly the mission in his sleep. But Doolittle still hadn't told them where they were going. The 2nd of April, 1942, San Francisco Bay. The USS Hornet, a brand new aircraft carrier, sat at dock as 16 B-25 bombers were loaded onto her deck. Dock workers and sailors stared in disbelief. Army bombers on a Navy carrier? What the hell was going on? The secrecy was so tight that even the Hornet's captain, Mark Mitcher, didn't know the mission details until they were at sea. When Doolittle finally gathered the crews and pulled out a map of Japan, the room went silent. "Gentlemen," Doolittle said, his voice steady, "we're going to bomb Tokyo." For a moment, no one breathed. Then someone whispered, "Holy hell." Doolittle laid out the stark reality. They'd launch 400 miles from Japan inside the patrol zone, but far enough to give the Hornet a chance to escape. After bombing their targets, they'd fly west to China, land at friendly airfields, and hope the Chinese could help them get home. It was 2,000 miles over open ocean, then over enemy territory, at night, with barely enough fuel to make it. If they miscalculated by even 10%, they'd crash in the ocean or in Japanese-occupied China. And if they were captured? Japan didn't follow the Geneva Convention. Torture and execution were guaranteed. Doolittle looked each man in the eye. "If anyone wants out, now's the time. No one will think less of you." Not one man moved. The 18th of April, 1942. 650 miles east of Japan. Dawn. The alarm klaxon shattered the morning silence on the Hornet. A Japanese patrol boat had spotted them 200 miles earlier than planned. The boat's radio operator was frantically sending warnings back to Tokyo. The Hornet's escort ships blew the patrol boat out of the water with naval gunfire, but the damage was done. Japan knew American ships were approaching. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the task force, made the brutal calculation. They had to launch immediately, even though they were 650 miles out instead of 400. It would be daylight instead of dusk. The bombers would have 200 fewer miles of fuel they desperately needed for the flight to China. Most of the crews wouldn't make it. Halsey knew it, Doolittle knew it. But if they didn't launch now, the mission was scrubbed, and they'd sail home having accomplished nothing. Doolittle climbed into the cockpit of the lead bomber. The Hornet turned into the wind, her deck pitching in the heavy seas. Waves crashed over the bow. Rain pelted the windscreen. Lieutenant Henry Miller, the Hornet's flight deck officer, stood at the bow with signal flags, timing the ship's roll. He had to launch Doolittle at the exact moment the deck pitched upward, giving him a few extra precious feet of lift. The B-25's engines roared to full throttle. The brakes released. The bomber thundered down the deck, wind and spray whipping past. The bow dropped into a trough. Miller's flags flashed. Now, Doolittle hauled back on the yoke. The bomber dropped off the end of the deck, falling toward the churning water. For one terrible second, it looked like it would plow into the waves. Then the engines bit into the air, and the bomber clawed upward, pulling away from the water with barely 50 feet to spare. Behind him, 15 more bombers followed. One by one, each barely clearing the deck, they formed up in a loose group and turned west, toward Japan, toward Tokyo, toward a target no one believed they could reach. The mission everyone said was impossible had just begun. The 18th of April, 1942. 10 a.m. 300 miles east of Japan. For 3.5 hours, 16 B-25 bombers skimmed across the Pacific at wave-top level, so low that spray from the Whitecaps occasionally hit their fuselages. They flew in loose formation, spread out to avoid presenting a single target to Japanese fighters. Inside Doolittle's lead plane, the crew was silent. Each man knew the math. They'd burn through fuel getting off the carrier early. They'd burn more flying low to avoid radar. By the time they reached China, their tanks would be nearly dry, and that was if everything went perfectly. Navigator Lieutenant Henry Potter kept rechecking his calculations, hoping he'd made an error that would give them a few more miles. He hadn't. Co-pilot Lieutenant Richard Cole watched the fuel gauges like a hawk. Every needle drop felt like a countdown to disaster. But Doolittle's focus was absolute. His hands were steady on the controls, his eyes scanning the horizon. This close to the water, one moment of inattention meant death. At 11:30 a.m., the Japanese coastline appeared through the haze. "There she is," Doolittle said quietly. "The land of the rising Sunday." They'd made it. Now came the hard part. 11:45 a.m., approaching Tokyo. As the bombers crossed the coast, Doolittle pulled up to 1,500 feet, just high enough to avoid hitting buildings, low enough to make accurate bombing runs. The other planes spread out toward their individual targets: military installations, factories, oil refineries, naval yards. What happened next shocked the crews. Nothing. No air raid sirens. No anti-aircraft fire. No fighter planes scrambling to intercept them. Tokyo had no idea they were coming. The early warning from the patrol boat had alerted Japanese Naval Command. But in a catastrophic communication failure, no one had informed Tokyo's air defenses. The Japanese simply couldn't process that American bombers could possibly be over their capital. Some thought the planes were Japanese. Others thought they were hallucinating. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, piloting the 7th plane, couldn't believe what he was seeing below. People were walking the streets. Kids were playing in schoolyards. It was a normal Saturday afternoon. They had no idea what was about to happen. The bombers roared over the city at rooftop level, so low that crews could see people's faces as they looked up in confusion. Some Japanese citizens actually waved. Then, the bombs started falling. 12:15 p.m. Tokyo. Doolittle's bombardier, Sergeant Fred Bramer, called out, "Target in sight, industrial complex, 2 o'clock. "Bombs away," Doolittle ordered. 4 500-pound bombs tumbled from the belly of the plane. Seconds later, a massive fireball erupted from a factory complex. Secondary explosions rippled outward as fuel tanks ignited. Behind Doolittle, 15 more bombers unleashed their payloads across Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, and Nagoya. Shipyards exploded. Oil refineries burst into flames. A steel plant collapsed. Lieutenant Travis Hoover's plane dropped incendiary clusters on a military barracks. The phosphorus bombs created a wall of fire visible for miles. One bomber targeted the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, where the Japanese were building aircraft carriers. The bomb struck a workshop filled with partially assembled plane engines, setting off a chain reaction of explosions that destroyed 6 months of production. Now Tokyo's defenses finally woke up. Air raid sirens began wailing across the city. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with black puffs of flak. Japanese fighter planes scrambled from nearby airfields, pilots sprinting to their aircraft in confusion and rage. But it was too late. The American bombers were already banking away, diving back to wave-top level, racing toward the western horizon at maximum speed. The entire attack had lasted less than 30 minutes. 12:45 p.m. Leaving Japan. As Lieutenant Bob Gray's bomber cleared the coast, his tail gunner, Sergeant Eldred Scott, watched Tokyo receding behind them. Smoke columns rose thousands of feet into the air, visible for 50 miles. The city looked like it was burning from end to end. "My God," Scott whispered. "We actually did it." But there was no celebration in the cockpit. Every crew knew the hardest part was ahead of them. They had 1,300 miles to fly over the East China Sea with barely enough fuel to make it, and that was if they didn't encounter headwinds. They'd be flying in darkness for most of the journey, navigating by dead reckoning over a featureless ocean. And when they reached China, they'd have to find friendly airfields in a country where Japanese forces controlled much of the territory. One crew had already turned back. Lieutenant Edgar McElroy's plane had developed engine trouble over Tokyo. Rather than risk ditching in the ocean, he'd made the agonizing decision to head for the Soviet Union instead. The Soviet Union was neutral, but it was better than drowning. The other 15 bombers pressed on into the setting Sunday, 6:30 p.m., over the East China Sea. As darkness fell, the bombers scattered. Some headed northwest toward Shanghai. Others aimed for airfields deeper in free China. They'd lost radio contact with each other and were flying on hope and fumes. Inside Doolittle's cockpit, the situation was deteriorating. Headwinds had cut their fuel efficiency by 15%. The weather was worsening, heavy clouds, poor visibility. They should have reached the Chinese coast an hour ago. "We're lost," Navigator Henry Potter admitted. "The winds pushed us off course. I don't know by how much." Doolittle checked the fuel gauges. Both tanks were reading nearly empty. They had maybe 30 minutes of flying time left, if that. "Keep looking for lights," Doolittle said. Any lights. But below them was only darkness. The Chinese airfields were supposed to light signal fires to guide them in. There were no fires, no lights, nothing. What Doolittle didn't know, what none of the crews knew, was that a communication breakdown had left the Chinese completely unaware they were coming. The airfields were dark because no one expected American planes. One by one, the fuel warning lights began flashing red in every bomber. 9:15 p.m. over China. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's bomber was the first to go down. Both engines sputtered and died over the Chinese coast. In the sudden silence, Hallmark had seconds to decide. Try to crash land in the dark or bail out over unknown terrain. "We're jumping," he ordered. "Everybody out. Now." One by one, his crew leaped into the darkness. Their parachutes blossomed, and they drifted down toward whatever lay below mountains. Water, Japanese soldiers, or friendly Chinese. Hallmark was the last to jump. As he tumbled through the air, he watched his bomber spiral down and explode in a valley below. Minutes later, Lieutenant Bill Farrow's plane ran out of fuel. Then Lieutenant Bob Height's. Across the Chinese coast, bombers were falling from the sky. In Doolittle's plane, the port engine coughed, sputtered, and died. "That's it," Cole said. "We're done." Doolittle didn't hesitate. "Prepare to bail out." The crew scrambled to the rear of the plane, checking their parachutes in the dim emergency lighting. The starboard engine was still running, but barely. Doolittle held the plane as steady as he could while his men jumped one by one into the blackness. Bombardier Fred Bramer hesitated at the door, staring into the void. "Go," Doolittle shouted. "Go. Now." Bramer jumped. Navigator Potter followed. Gunner Paul Leonard disappeared into the night. Doolittle was alone in the cockpit. The starboard engine was screaming, running on vapor. The altimeter showed 6,000 feet, 5,000, 500, 5,000. He set the autopilot to keep the plane flying straight, unbuckled his harness, and ran for the rear door. At 4,000 feet, he jumped. The slipstream caught him like a giant fist, spinning him end over end. His hand found the ripcord and yanked. The parachute snapped open with a violent jerk. Below him, his bomber, the plane that had done the impossible, dove into the Chinese mountains and exploded in a ball of flame. Doolittle drifted down through the rain and darkness, wondering if he just led 80 men to their deaths. Midnight. Scattered across China. Of the 16 bombers, 15 had crashed in China or ditched off the coast. The 16th, McElroy's plane, had landed in the Soviet Union, where the crew was immediately interned, technically prisoners, but alive. The other 75 men were scattered across hundreds of miles of Chinese territory. Some had landed in rice paddies, others in mountains. Some were injured, bones broken from hard landings. Several were unconscious, and some, the unluckiest, had landed in Japanese-occupied territory. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's entire crew came down near the city of Poyang. As they struggled out of their parachute harnesses, Japanese soldiers surrounded them. Within hours, they were bound, blindfolded, and thrown into military trucks. Lieutenant Bill Farrow's crew met the same fate. Then Lieutenant Bob Height's. 8 Americans were now prisoners of the Japanese Empire. What awaited them was beyond imagination. But scattered across free China, other crews were luckier. Chinese civilians, at great risk to themselves, were finding American pilots in the darkness, bruised, exhausted, and lost, and hiding them from Japanese patrols. The mission was over. The bombing of Tokyo had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Now came the desperate fight for survival. The 19th of April, 1942. Dawn. Somewhere in the mountains of China, Jimmy Doolittle woke up in a rice paddy, covered in mud, his body screaming with pain. He'd landed hard in the darkness, his parachute snagging on a hillside. He'd tumbled down a slope, crashed through brush, and finally come to rest in freezing water. For hours, he'd lain there in the dark, unsure if he was in free China or Japanese-occupied territory. Unsure if his back was broken. Unsure if any of his crew had survived. As gray light filtered through the mist, Doolittle pulled himself to his feet. Everything hurt, but nothing seemed broken. He was alive, but he was also certain of something else. He had failed. All 16 bombers destroyed. Crews scattered or dead. The greatest raid in American history had ended with total loss of aircraft. He'd be court-martialed. His career was over. He'd let down his country, his president, his men. Doolittle pulled out his pistol and stared at it for a long moment. Then he heard voices. Chinese voices. Through the mist came a group of Chinese farmers, carrying tools. When they saw the muddy American officer with his pistol drawn, they stopped. For a tense moment, nobody moved. Then one of the farmers smiled and said in broken English, "American? Megwo?" Doolittle nodded, lowering his weapon. The farmers rushed forward, bowing and shaking his hand. They were laughing, excited. One kept repeating, "Ding hao, ding hao, very good." They led Doolittle to their village, where he discovered something that would change everything. The Chinese already knew about the Tokyo raid. Word had spread like wildfire across free China. The Americans who bombed Japan were heroes, but Doolittle had no idea where his crew was, or if they were even alive. The same morning, scattered across eastern China, what followed was one of the most remarkable rescue operations in history. One that would cost thousands of Chinese lives. Across hundreds of miles, Chinese civilians were finding American airmen injured, lost, unable to speak the language, and risking everything to save them. Lieutenant Ted Lawson had crash-landed in the ocean off the coast. His leg was shattered, nearly severed. His crew dragged him to shore, where Chinese fishermen found them. The fishermen could have turned them in to the Japanese for a reward. Instead, they carried Lawson for days through the mountains to find a doctor. The doctor was a Chinese missionary named Dr. Chen. He had no anesthesia, no proper surgical tools. Using a hacksaw sterilized over a fire, Dr. Chen amputated Lawson's leg to save his life. Lawson bit down on a leather strap and tried not to scream. Lieutenant Harold Watson's crew was found by Chinese guerrilla fighters who were actively battling Japanese forces. The guerrillas hid the Americans in caves, shared their meager food supplies, and guided them through enemy lines for weeks. Lieutenant Don Smith came down near a Chinese military outpost. The soldiers there hadn't been paid in months, were starving themselves, but they gave the Americans their only food, a bag of rice, and escorted them to safety. Time and again, Chinese civilians put themselves in mortal danger to protect American pilots they'd never met, couldn't communicate with, and might never see again. Why? Because they knew what would happen if the Japanese discovered they'd helped Americans. The 20th of April, 1942. Japanese military headquarters, Shanghai. When Japanese military intelligence confirmed that American bombers had struck Japan, Launched from a carrier, no less the rage was volcanic. General Shunroku Hata, commander of Japanese forces in China, received direct orders from Tokyo: find the American pilots, punish anyone who helped them. The Japanese knew some crews had bailed out over territory they controlled. They also knew the Chinese were helping the Americans escape. What followed was one of the most brutal retaliation campaigns of the war. Japanese troops swept through the Chinese provinces, where the bombers had crashed Zhejiang and Jiangxi. Village by village, they searched for Americans and anyone who might have helped them. The village of Nanchang had hidden 2 American airmen and helped them escape. When the Japanese arrived and the Americans were gone, they rounded up the entire village, men, women, children. Then they burned it to the ground with many of the villagers still inside. In Ihuang, Japanese soldiers learned that locals had given food to American pilots. The soldiers executed 250 civilians, including the town's mayor, in the village square. The city of Yushan had treated injured American airmen. Japanese forces killed 10,000 people there. 10,000. Village after village was destroyed. Chinese sources estimate that over 250,000 civilians were killed in the retaliation campaign, murdered specifically because they had helped American pilots. And that wasn't even the worst of it. May 1942. Japanese biological warfare units. The Japanese military wanted to ensure that American bombers could never use Chinese airfields again. They deployed Unit 731, the Biological Warfare Division, to contaminate water supplies and spread diseases in the regions where the Doolittle raiders had crashed. Cholera, typhus, plague, and anthrax were deliberately introduced into wells, rivers, and food supplies. The diseases spread uncontrollably, killing an estimated additional 250,000 Chinese civilians over the following months. 500,000 people, maybe more, died because they lived in areas where American pilots had landed. The Chinese people knew this would happen. They did it anyway. When Doolittle learned of the reprisals months later, he was devastated. He told friends he wished he'd never led the raid. The guilt haunted him for the rest of his life. But there was still one more horror to unfold. August 1942. Shanghai, Japanese military prison. 8 American airmen had been captured alive. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's crew, Lieutenant Bill Farrow's crew, and Lieutenant Bob Height's crew. They'd been held in solitary confinement for months, given minimal food and water, interrogated repeatedly. The Japanese wanted to know everything about the raid: how the bombers launched from carriers, what the targets were, what other operations were planned. The Americans gave only name, rank, and serial number. On the 15th of August 1942, the 8 prisoners were put on trial, a trial that was a mockery of justice. They were charged with bombing civilian targets, machine gunning schools, and war crimes. The evidence was fabricated. The trial lasted 1 day. No defense was permitted. All 8 were sentenced to death. Then, in what Japanese officials apparently believed was an act of mercy, 5 of the sentences were commuted to life in prison. 3 were not. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant Bill Farrow, Sergeant Harold Spatz. On the 15th of October 1942, at Bridge House Prison in Shanghai, the 3 young Americans were led to wooden posts in the courtyard. They were bound, but not blindfolded. The Japanese wanted them to see what was coming. A firing squad of Japanese soldiers raised their rifles. Lieutenant Bill Farrow's last words were, "Tell my mother I died fighting for my country and unafraid." The rifles cracked. 3 Americans fell. They were 24, 24, and 26 years old. The 5 survivors. The 5 Americans whose death sentences were commuted. Lieutenants Bob Height, Chase Nielsen, George Barr, and Corporal Jake DeShazer were sent to various prisons across China and Japan. For the next 3 years, they endured unimaginable suffering. They were kept in solitary confinement in cells too small to stand up in. They were given 1 bowl of rice per day, sometimes less. They were beaten regularly, tortured for information, and denied medical care. Lieutenant George Barr went blind from malnutrition. He weighed less than 80 pounds when the war ended. Corporal Jake DeShazer spent 40 months in solitary. To keep his sanity, he memorized every detail of his life, every conversation, every mission. He carved marks in the wall to track the days. Bob Haidt and Chase Nielsen were moved from prison to prison, never knowing if they'd be executed or when the war might end. And then, in August 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. American forces raced to find POW camps before Japanese guards could execute the prisoners. In a camp near Beijing, they found 4 survivors of the Doolittle raid, skeletal, barely able to walk, but alive. George Barr was found separately, close to death, his eyesight never fully recovered. 5 of the 8 captured raiders survived. 3 had been murdered. 71 of the 80 raiders made it home. Meanwhile, Doolittle's journey home. After the Chinese villagers found Doolittle, he spent weeks trekking across China, gathering his scattered crews. One by one, survivors made their way to Chongqing, the wartime capital of Free China. Lieutenant Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, arrived with a twisted ankle but otherwise fine. Navigator Henry Potter had broken ribs. Bombardier Fred Bramer was bruised but intact. Slowly, impossibly, most of the crews filtered in. 3 men had died in crashes. 8 were captured. The rest, 69 men, had escaped. When Doolittle finally made it back to American lines and sent his report to General Henry Hap Arnold, he was certain he'd be court-martialed for losing 16 bombers. Arnold's response stunned him. Doolittle was promoted to brigadier general on the spot, skipping the rank of colonel entirely, and awarded the Medal of Honor. President Roosevelt himself praised the raid as one of the most courageous operations in American military history. Doolittle stood in disbelief. "But, sir, I lost every plane." "Jimmy," Arnold said, "you gave America hope when we needed it most. You proved we could hit back. You scared the hell out of Japan, and you changed the course of this war." And he was right. The aftermath. The Doolittle raid killed fewer than 100 Japanese and caused minimal physical damage to Tokyo's infrastructure. By the cold mathematics of war, it was strategically insignificant. But psychologically, it was devastating. Japan's military leadership had promised the emperor that the homeland was invulnerable. In one afternoon, 16 American bombers shattered that illusion. The emperor demanded to know how Americans could attack Tokyo if the Navy was protecting the coast. The military had no good answer. The Japanese Navy's obsession with destroying American aircraft carriers, an obsession that led directly to the Battle of Midway, stemmed directly from the Doolittle raid. Japan sent its entire carrier fleet to attack Midway Island in June 1942, hoping to lure out and destroy the American carriers that had launched the Tokyo raid. Instead, American forces were waiting. In the Battle of Midway, the U.S. sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and killed hundreds of Japan's best pilots. Japan never recovered. The Battle of Midway turned the tide of the Pacific War. And it happened because Japan was terrified of another raid like Doolittle's. For America, the raid accomplished something even more important. It proved that fighting back was possible. After months of defeats, Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Wake Island, the Doolittle raid showed Americans that their forces could strike back, could reach the enemy, could win. Recruitment skyrocketed. War bond sales soared. The nation's morale, which had been in the gutter, surged. Jimmy Doolittle, the man who thought he'd failed, had given his country hope. The 18th of April, 1943, 1 year later, on the first anniversary of the Tokyo raid, President Franklin Roosevelt held a press conference. A reporter asked him where the bombers had come from. It was still officially classified. Roosevelt smiled mysteriously and said, "They came from Shangri-La." Shangri-La, the mythical paradise from the novel Lost Horizon, a place that didn't exist. The president was trolling the Japanese, and America loved it. But behind the humor was a truth the public didn't know. The raid that seemed like a suicide mission had fundamentally altered the course of World War II in ways no one anticipated. And for the men who flew it, the mission would define and haunt them for the rest of their lives. The immediate impact. Midway. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese combined fleet, was arguably the most brilliant naval strategist of his generation. He'd planned Pearl Harbor. He'd orchestrated Japan's lightning conquest of the Pacific. But the Doolittle raid broke something in him, or rather, in his superiors. When American bombers appeared over Tokyo, the Japanese imperial staff demanded to know how Yamamoto had allowed enemy carriers to approach the homeland undetected. His prestige, once unassailable, was suddenly in question. Yamamoto became obsessed with destroying American aircraft carriers. He devised a plan to lure them into a trap at Midway Island, a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific. He would commit Japan's entire carrier fleet, 6 aircraft carriers, the most powerful naval force ever assembled, to annihilate the American carriers once and for all. It was overkill, reckless even. On the 4th of June 1942, less than 2 months after Tokyo was bombed, the Battle of Midway began. American codebreakers had cracked Japanese communications and knew the attack was coming. When Yamamoto's carriers arrived at Midway, American dive bombers were waiting. In 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, American planes sank 3 Japanese aircraft carriers. A 4th sank later that day. Japan lost 4 carriers, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 men, including many of its most experienced pilots. The Japanese Navy never recovered. The tide of the Pacific War turned in one afternoon, and it all traced back to 16 B-25 bombers over Tokyo. June 1942, Washington, D.C. When the 5 imprisoned Doolittle raiders were executed or sentenced to life imprisonment, the news was kept from the American public. The military didn't want to damage morale or give the Japanese propaganda value, but word leaked out, and the reaction was fury. The execution of American prisoners who had conducted a legitimate military operation, prisoners who should have been protected under international law, galvanized American resolve. The idea of negotiating peace with Japan became unthinkable. This was now a war to unconditional surrender. The raid also triggered a surge in military recruitment. Young men across America wanted to be Doolittle's raiders. The Army Air Force was flooded with volunteers. One of those volunteers was a young pilot named Paul Tibbets. Inspired by the Tokyo raid, Tibbets would go on to pilot the Enola Gay, the B-29 that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima in 1945. The raid's ripples kept spreading. The raiders after the war. When the war ended in August 1945, the surviving raiders came home to a hero's welcome. But for many, the hero's welcome felt hollow. Jimmy Doolittle went on to command the 8th Air Force in Europe, leading the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. He retired as a 4-star general, one of the most decorated officers in American history. But until the day he died in 1993, at age 96, he carried guilt about the Chinese civilians who died because of his raid. In interviews late in life, Doolittle said, "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to justify what we did. The cost was so high." Ted Lawson, the pilot who lost his leg, wrote a memoir called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo that became a bestseller and a major Hollywood film in 1944. But Lawson struggled with phantom pain and survivor's guilt for decades. He died in 1992. Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, became the last surviving member of the raid. He lived to be 103, dying in 2019. Until the end, he attended every Doolittle Raiders reunion, keeping the memory alive. Chase Nielsen, one of the 5 captured raiders who survived imprisonment, struggled with what we'd now call PTSD. He had nightmares about the torture, the executions, the starvation. But he also became a passionate advocate for POW rights and spent decades testifying about Japanese war crimes. Jake DeShazer, another survivor of Japanese imprisonment, did something remarkable. He became a Christian missionary and returned to Japan in 1948 to preach forgiveness. The man who'd bombed Tokyo and been tortured for years spent the rest of his life working for reconciliation between America and Japan. He died in 2008 at age 95. And then there was Robert Hite, the pilot who'd been captured and imprisoned. Haidt came home in 1945 weighing 80 pounds, his body broken. He spent months in military hospitals recovering. When he was finally healthy enough to return to civilian life, he made a decision. He would live every day to honor the men who didn't make it home. Haidt became a successful hotel executive, raised a family, and never spoke publicly about his torture until the 1,980 seconds. When asked why, he said, "I didn't want to be known as a victim. I wanted to be known as someone who did his job and came home." He died in 2015 at age 95. The Goblet Tradition. In 1946, the city of Tucson, Arizona presented the Raiders with a special gift: 80 silver goblets, each engraved with a Raider's name. One goblet for each man who flew the mission. The goblets were placed in a special case at the Air Force Academy. Every year, on April 18th, the surviving Raiders would gather for a reunion. They'd toast their fallen comrades, and each year they'd turn upside down the goblets of those who had died since the last reunion. It became one of the most sacred traditions in military history. As the decades passed, fewer and fewer Raiders attended. The toasts became quieter. More goblets were turned upside down. In 1959, they opened a bottle of cognac, a bottle from 1896, the year Jimmy Doolittle was born. It was decided that the last two surviving Raiders would open the bottle and toast their fallen brothers one final time. The reunions continued. 1,970 seconds. 1,980 seconds. 1,990 seconds. The Raiders grew old, but they kept gathering, kept remembering. By 2000, only a handful remained. By 2013, only 4 were left. The 9th of November, 2013. Fort Walton Beach, Florida. The final toast. In a hangar at the Air Force Armament Museum, 4 elderly men gathered. Richard Cole, 98. Edward Saylor, 93. Robert Haidt, 93. David Thatcher, 92. They were the last of the 80 who had done the impossible 71 years earlier. The room was filled with veterans, military officers, and family members. The silver goblets were brought out. 76 goblets stood upside down. Only 4 remained upright. The men decided this was it. This would be the final toast. Staff Sergeant Cole opened the bottle of 1,896 cognac, the bottle they'd saved for this moment. The amber liquid poured into the 4 goblets. Cole, Saylor, Haidt, Thatcher. They stood slowly, painfully, but they stood. Cole raised his goblet. To those who gave their lives, and to those we've lost since, you're still with us. You'll always be with us. The 4 men drank. Some in the crowd were weeping. Then, one by one, they turned their own goblets upside down. The mission was finally, truly, over. The legacy. In 2015, Robert Haidt passed away. Then David Thatcher in 2016. Edward Saylor in 2015. On the 9th of April 2019, Richard Cole Doolittle's co-pilot, the man who'd been there from the beginning, died in his sleep in Texas. He was 103 years old. The last of the Doolittle Raiders was gone. But what they did, what those 80 young men accomplished on the 18th of April 1942 lives on. The raid showed that audacity could overcome impossible odds. That morale and courage could matter as much as firepower. That sometimes the psychological impact of an action matters more than its physical results. Every modern military operation that seems impossible, every long-range raid, every surprise strike owes something to what Doolittle and his raiders proved was possible. The B-25 bombers they flew, the ones everyone said were too big to launch from a carrier, that's standard practice now. Modern navies launch planes far larger from carriers routinely. Doolittle proved it could be done. The Chinese people who saved most of the crews, who sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives, They're remembered now. Memorials stand in the villages that were destroyed. The raiders never forgot what the Chinese people did for them, and the three men executed Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz. They're buried with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery. Their names are engraved on the Wall of Honor at the Air Force Academy. They're remembered. The 18th of April, 2025. 83 years later, today, the 80 silver goblets remain on display at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. All 80 now rest upside down. Visitors stand before the case in silence, reading the names engraved on each goblet. Names of men who were 20, 22, 25 years old when they climbed into bombers and flew toward a target no one believed they could reach. Next to the goblets is Doolittle's Medal of Honor, his flight jacket, a piece of one of the bombers, recovered from a Chinese mountainside, and on the wall, a simple plaque with Doolittle's words, "There is nothing stronger than the heart of a volunteer." On the 18th of April, 1942, 80 American volunteers did something that changed history. They proved that America could fight back, that courage and ingenuity could overcome impossible odds, that even in the darkest hours, hope could prevail. They attacked a target no one believed they could reach, and they showed the world what Americans were capable of. The Doolittle raid wasn't the longest mission of World War II. It wasn't the deadliest. It didn't win the war by itself, but it changed everything. And when you stand before those 80 silver goblets, all turned upside down now, you realize this wasn't just a story about a daring raid. It was a story about what happens when ordinary people choose to do something extraordinary, knowing the cost, accepting the risk, and doing it anyway. That's the legacy of the Doolittle Raiders. That's why, 83 years later, we still remember their names. The end. In memory of the 80 Doolittle Raiders, the 3 who were executed, the Chinese people who saved them at unimaginable cost, and all those who proved that the impossible is only impossible until someone does it.